Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, let's jump right in. Today we're diving deep into Canadian youth counterculture.
Oh, the 60s and 70s, right?
Yep. Specifically looking at why Canadian students got caught up in the movement, how it all played out up north.
And what kind of lasting impacts it had.
Exactly. We'll be using this really interesting online lecture. It's from a podcast called Mr. Hutchings History.
Oh, I've heard of that one. It's all about key moments in Canadian history, yeah?
It is. And this lecture poses this thought-provoking question, like, was the Canadian counterculture revolution?
Like a missed opportunity, or...
Yeah, or did it kind of subtly reshape the country's cultural and political landscape? It's really fascinating.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It is interesting how Canada's experience with, like, that whole 60s counterculture thing,
Yeah.
it seemed different from, say, the US or Europe.
Totally. So the lecture actually starts with this quote from historian J.M. Bumstead. He says, "Revolution was in the air in 1960s Canada."
Ooh, that's a good one.
But then he goes on to say, but it never quite arrived.
Huh. Yeah, so Canadian youth were definitely feeling that rebellious energy like their counterparts in the US or Europe.
Right.
But it seems like things unfolded differently in Canada. We got to figure out why.
For sure. So where do we even begin with all of this? It seems like a huge topic.
Well, the lecture breaks it down into two main threads: political activism and the whole yearning for personal fulfillment.
So like students taking to the streets demanding change versus like that hippie vibe of peace, love, and individuality.
You got it. Let's start with the political side. The lecture mentions this New Left movement.
The New Left, what's that all about?
Yeah, so basically it emerged in the 60s, challenging those traditional Marxist ideas,
Okay.
and they focused more on social issues, things like racial equality, feminism, and opposition to the Vietnam War.
I see. So this New Left energy really took root on Canadian university campuses.
Big time. A lot of the student activism during this time was part of that broader New Left movement. In fact, Canadian students even formed their own organizations.
Oh, really? Like
Well, there was SPA.
this BA.
Yeah, the Student Union for Peace Action. It was formed back in 1965.
Wow. So not just protests, but actual organized groups pushing for change.
Absolutely. And they had goals, too, like addressing social inequalities, advocating for peace, and just generally questioning the status quo.
So which universities were like the hotspots for all this activism?
Well, the lecture specifically mentions Simon Fraser University, York University, and the Université de Montreal.
Got it. Any particular events that stand out from that time?
Oh, there's one that really sticks out: the 1969 Sir George Williams University Computer Center occupation.
Oh, yeah. Wasn't that sparked by racial tensions?
It was. A professor was accused of racism, but the charges were dismissed, so students occupied the computer center.
And things escalated pretty quickly, right?
They did. Millions of dollars in damages, 41 black students arrested, many of whom were from the Caribbean.
Wow, that's heavy. A stark reminder of the racial injustices that were happening.
Yeah, it really highlights that for many, the counterculture wasn't just about peace and love, but also about fighting for basic rights.
Right. And I know that in Quebec, things were even more intense.
Oh, for sure. You had the FLQ, or Front de Libération du Québec.
A group of young activists who, I think, believed in Quebec's independence, right?
Exactly. And they weren't afraid to use violence to get their point across. Between 1963 and 1970, they conducted over 200 bombings.
Whoa, 200. That's a lot. What were they targeting?
Mostly symbols of the federal government and Anglo-Canadian businesses.
So it wasn't just a youth movement. It was tied into this whole idea of Quebec nationalism.
You could say that, and things came to a head in 1970 with the October crisis.
Oh, right, when the FLQ kidnapped those two government officials?
Yep, James Cross and Pierre Laporte. They demanded the release of FLQ prisoners and wanted their manifesto broadcast.
Tragically, Laporte was killed during the kidnapping.
He was. And then Prime Minister Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act.
Wasn't that basically imposing martial law?
It was. It gave the government a lot of power. Arrests without charges, media censorship, all that.
Wow, that's a pretty drastic response. It must have been a really tense time.
It was. But as historian Robert Bothwell points out, the situation in Quebec was kind of unique.
How so?
Many older French Canadians actually sympathized with the younger generation. They saw it as part of this fight against Anglo-Canadian dominance.
Ah, so it wasn't just the generational divide. It was tied into this larger sense of cultural and political tension.
Precisely. And the FLQ's actions, along with the government's response, really shaped Quebec's political landscape for years to come.
So we've got student protests, bombings, martial law, It sounds like Canada in the 60s and early 70s was a pretty wild time.
It was. But remember, the counterculture wasn't just about politics. There was this whole other side focused on personal liberation.
Right, like the hippie movement with its emphasis on peace and love, that rejection of materialism.
Exactly. It was about finding your own truth, connecting with nature, and creating alternative communities.
Like those communes that popped up everywhere.
Yes. Especially in rural areas like British Columbia, they represented this rejection of mainstream values, this attempt to build a more egalitarian and sustainable way of life.
Interesting. Do you think those communes, those experiments in alternative living, had any influence on today's interest in sustainability?
Oh, I think so. That rejection of consumerism, the focus on simple living, those ideas definitely resonate today with the environmental movement.
You're right. It's like those ideas from the 60s have come full circle in a way.
Absolutely. Think about the tiny house movement or the minimalist lifestyle. It all connects.
That's a great point. So it wasn't just about political rallies and protests. It was also about changing your whole way of life.
Yeah, finding your own truth and expressing yourself.
And what about the role of music? I mean, it was such a huge part of the counterculture movement.
Huge. The lecture mentions Woodstock, iconic musicians like Jimi Hendrix.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Those were big influences, for sure. What about Canadian artists? Were there any who captured the spirit of the times?
Absolutely. Bands like The Guess Who, Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen.
Yeah, their music really reflected that yearning for change and that desire to break free from societal norms.
It wasn't just entertainment, it was about expression, identity, and rebellion.
Totally. So we've got political movements, communes, music. It's like the counterculture was this whole cultural shift that started to reshape Canadian identity.
Yeah, and to really understand it, we need to look at it through different lenses. The lecture mentions cultural history, social history, political history, even post-colonial theory.
Wow. Okay. Break those down for me. What do those different perspectives offer?
Well, cultural historians, they look at how young people change social norms through things like music, art, and lifestyle. They analyze those everyday expressions as powerful statements.
So they help us see how those everyday choices, like clothing or music, could be acts of rebellion.
Exactly. Then you have social historians are more interested in the dynamics of power and inequality.
Ah, so they might look at the Sir George Williams affair and see it as a symptom of those deeper racial tensions.
Exactly. And then there are the political historians. They focus on how the government reacted to all this.
So they'd be analyzing things like Trudeau invoking the War Measures Act, trying to understand how the Canadian political system handled all this dissent.
Right. And finally, you have post-colonial theory, which critiques those larger systems of power, like imperialism and capitalism.
So it places the Canadian counterculture within a global context of resistance.
Precisely. By using these different lenses, we can really start to understand how complex and significant this movement was.
This makes me want to dig into some primary sources, like what about the FLQ Manifesto or court records from the Sir George Williams protest?
Oh, those would be fascinating. We could get firsthand accounts of the motivations and experiences of the people involved.
Totally. And then there's all the music and literature from that era. We could really immerse ourselves in the counterculture.
We could really get a feel for what it was like to live through those times.
This has been quite the whirlwind tour. I'm starting to see how complex this whole counterculture movement was.
We've only just scratched the surface. There's still so much more to uncover.
Well, luckily for us, this is a deep dive, so we have plenty of time to unpack it all.
Yeah, we'll pick it up right where we left off after a quick break.
Sounds good. We'll be back in a moment to continue our exploration. Welcome back to our deep dive into Canadian counterculture. Before the break, we were exploring those two sides of the movement.
The protests and the personal liberation stuff.
Right. But did all that rebellion actually lead to lasting change?
That's the big question, isn't it? Like, did it really revolutionize Canadian society, or was it just a phase?
Yeah, like they didn't overthrow the government or anything, so what was the point?
Well, I think it's more nuanced than that. Canada didn't have a dramatic revolution in the 60s and 70s.
Right.
But the counterculture definitely left its mark. Think of it less like an explosion and more like ripples in a pond.
Okay, I like that. So what were some of those ripples? Like what concrete changes can we trace back to that era?
Well, you could argue that the activism of the 60s paved the way for some major social progress.
Like what?
Well, for one, advancements in education. A lot of universities became more inclusive, more responsive to student demands.
So those protests, even though they might have seemed chaotic at the time, were actually pushing those important issues to the forefront.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about policies or laws, it was about changing the national conversation.
How so?
Well, it challenged traditional values and opened up space for different voices. The women's liberation movement gained momentum during this.
Oh, right, advocating for gender equality and all that.
Exactly. And there was a growing recognition of Indigenous rights, too.
Wow, it's like they were ahead of their time on a lot of issues that are still relevant today.
They were. And don't forget the hippie movement.
Right, with the peace, love, and personal liberation.
It foreshadowed some major cultural shifts, too.
Okay, so we've talked about communes, but weren't they kind of messy? How did they actually function?
Yeah, communal living definitely had its challenges. It wasn't a utopia,
Right.
but it was an experiment,
Yeah.
an attempt to create a different kind of community.
And even though most communes didn't last, they did plant some seeds, right? Like the whole environmentalism thing.
Exactly. Their focus on simple living and sustainability is definitely reflected in today's movements.
It's amazing how those ideas from the 60s have become so mainstream now.
It is. So maybe the Canadian counterculture wasn't about achieving a dramatic revolution.
But more about planting those seeds of change.
That's a great way to put it. Which brings us back to that question from the lecture. Was it a missed opportunity for revolution, or did it subtly reshape the nation?
So what do you think? After looking at all this, how would you answer that question?
I think it was a bit of both, to be honest.
Okay.
They didn't achieve a political revolution in the sense of overthrowing the government, but they did push boundaries, challenge the status quo.
It's like they loosened the soil, planted the seeds, and then it was up to future generations to nurture them.
Exactly. And change doesn't always happen overnight. Sometimes it's a slow burn.
Right. So we've established that the Canadian counterculture did have a lasting impact. But why should we, like sitting here in the 21st century, care about this?
That's a great question. And I think there are a few reasons why understanding this period is still relevant today.
Okay, I'm listening.
Well, for one, it shows us how complex social change really is.
Meaning?
We often think of progress as linear, but the counterculture shows us that it's messy, unpredictable.
So it's not about expecting overnight revolutions, but about recognizing those small steps that can lead to bigger transformations.
Precisely. And the counterculture also challenges us to rethink our definition of progress.
We mean?
We often focus on technology and economic growth, but the counterculture reminds us that true progress also includes social justice, sustainability, a sense of community.
It's like they were saying, hey, what about the things that really matter?
Exactly. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the counterculture reminds us of the power of individual action.
Right, those young people weren't waiting for someone else to fix things. They were taking action, demanding change.
Exactly. And we can do the same. We don't have to be politicians or celebrities to make a difference.
It's inspiring to think about.
It is. They showed us that you can be a student, an artist, an everyday person who cares enough to speak up.
It gives you hope for the future.
It does. Their story is a reminder of how far we've come and an inspiration to keep pushing for a better world.
You know, one thing that really struck me is how they championed individuality.
Yeah, that's so relevant today with all the pressure to conform, especially online.
It is. So how do we tap into that same spirit of rebellion and use it to create positive change?
That's a great question, and that's what we'll explore in our final part. Stay tuned.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the Canadian counterculture. We've talked about protests, communes, music, and so much more.
And we've seen how this era still has an impact on us today. But how can we actually use that spirit of rebellion, to make a difference now?
Yeah, it's one thing to look back and say, wow, those hippies were cool. But it's another to actually apply those ideas to our own lives.
Right, like we're not going to start bombing buildings or running off to join communes.
Exactly. So how do we translate those ideals into something meaningful in the 21st century?
Well, the counterculture was about more than just rebelling for the sake of it. It was about challenging norms, questioning authority.
And creating a better world.
Yeah. And those are things we can all do no matter who we are or what we believe.
Okay, that makes sense. But where do we even begin? The world feels so complicated these days.
It can be overwhelming. But remember those ripples in a pond. Even a small action can create ripples that spread out and have a wider impact.
So it's not about being a superhero, it's about those everyday actions that can add up.
Exactly. So what are some practical takeaways from the counterculture that we can use today?
Yeah, give me some concrete things we can do.
Okay, first off, remember that questioning authority isn't just about being defiant. It's about critical thinking.
Like, don't just accept everything you hear or read.
Exactly. Do your own research, challenge assumptions, form your own opinions. This applies to everything from the news to the products you buy.
So think critically. Got it. What else?
Embrace your individuality. That was huge for the counterculture. They were all about self-expression, authenticity, rejecting those pressures to conform.
That's easier said than done these days with social media and all that.
It is. But the counterculture reminds us that true happiness comes from being true to yourself, not trying to fit in.
So how do we resist those pressures?
Start by noticing what brings you joy, what makes you feel truly alive, and then allow yourself to explore those things, even if they're not cool or popular.
I like that. It's about reclaiming that counterculture spirit and using it to break free from expectations.
Exactly. It's about saying, this is me, and I'm not afraid to show it.
Okay, so we've got critical thinking and embracing individuality. What else can we add to the mix?
Remember that personal liberation is important, but it shouldn't stop there.
Right. The counterculture was also about social justice, making the world a better place.
Yes. They fought for peace, equality, a healthy environment, and those issues are still so relevant today.
But it's easy to feel like, what can I do? These problems are so big.
I hear you. But it's not about solving everything single-handedly. It's about finding your own way to contribute.
Like, even small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely. It could be volunteering, donating, raising awareness, even just having conversations with people about these issues.
It's about finding what you're passionate about and taking action.
Exactly. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up and using your voice.
Wow, this has been an incredible deep dive. We started with a question about the Canadian counterculture, and we've ended up with this whole toolkit for creating change.
It has been a journey. I hope everyone listening has learned something new about this era and how it still influences us today.
It wasn't just a moment in time, it was a mindset, right?
It was a spirit of questioning, challenging, and creating. And that spirit is still alive in all of us.
So what will you do to make a ripple?
That's something to think about. Until next time, keep questioning, keep challenging, and keep creating.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.